Jocelyn Goldfein, and I am the moderator for today's session on AI for startups and in the entrepreneurial world more generally. And my involvement in AI is that I am currently an investor at a VC firm that focuses only on AI startups. So we invest at the seed stage, only in B2B startups, only ones using AI to solve problems for their customers. And prior to joining Zetta Venture Partners, which is where I am now, I spent most of my career as an engineer, had worked at a number of startups, was a leader at VMware for a long time, and then 4 years at Facebook, where one of my principal contributions to the world, positive or negative, was adopting machine learning for the newsfeed ranker.
Hi, my name is Suresh. I'm an engineering director at Google. I lead the device software team for home and Nest devices, some of which you may be familiar with. My involvement with AI is, we take advantage of AI technology both on the cloud and device quite extensively to make our devices smarter. Before Google, I worked at a couple of semiconductor companies, including a high-performance, compute startup a few years ago.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Flomenberg. I'm a partner at Accel. I've been there for about 6 years. I used to work in the product functions at Cloudera and then Splunk, and focus on all things B2B, and like to joke, I don't really meet startups anymore that don't attach the term blockchain or AI to their pitch. So whatever it is, if it's T-shirts, it's usually AI for T-shirts. So I like to investigate the use and abuse of the term AI as I invest.
Hi, I'm Dan Rubinstein. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a digital healthcare company called Physera. Before that, I had many years at Google and Facebook, a semiconductor company before then, and a PhD in statistics and pattern recognition from Stanford. So.
Wonderful. All right, well, welcome to everybody who's joined us. Looks like we do have a full house to discuss AI and entrepreneurship. And
there was a room change, so there might be people trickling in.
Okay. And more people may trickle in. But encourage all of you to get very involved in the conversation, dive in with questions, comments. But let me just kick things off, maybe get the ball rolling with a question that maybe Jake and Dan both kind of alluded to in their intros, which is, should startups even care about AI right out of the gate?
Yeah, so I'll jump in with my perspective, and being a venture capitalist, I have to think of these silly little frameworks, and they can't have more than 3 to 5 things, or it's too much for us to handle. But I think of this triangle, and the bottom in one corner is workflow. Here's what the software, hopefully it does something. Here's data. It's a data asset. You might have unique ways to gather data that other people have a hard time gathering. And up here, we can call this whatever you want. You can call it AI, you can call it fancy pants analytics, you can call it things that are only available in academia within the last 24 months. And for any startup that walks in the door, the question I ask myself before I really listen to their pitch is, where do they belong on the spectrum? And I would make a pretty strong argument that bottom line between data and workflow that doesn't have any of that advanced analytics is a pretty great place to start in the vast majority of cases. Now, there's certain exceptions. If you want to do very special cutting edge video processing, okay, maybe that's something that requires something a little different or a little bit more current. But I don't think in this sort of buzzy hype world, people spend enough time thinking about what they really need to do at the outset. What is their value proposition at t equals 0, right when you start, and how much AI is necessary. And over time, you can constantly ask yourself the question, how much advanced analytics do I need, and what is the ROI? I can crawl, walk, and run towards AI. Linear regression might actually solve my problem. I don't necessarily need a 10-layer DNN before I start my company.
I have nothing controversial to add to that. I would agree with you wholeheartedly. In our company, for example, we're going after trying to improve care pathways using data and AI, but the AI piece is something that we're building towards. Right now, we're focusing on getting a lot of patient data, building our models, training the systems, but it's going to take a couple of years before we're getting there.
I think I totally agree with the point Jake made, but one thing I do want to highlight is what's happening in the ecosystem. I know some of it is obviously hype, but there is a lot of investment that's going into enabling various technologies that make AI more affordable, right? When I say affordable, think of some of the examples of use cases we have seen in terms of voice processing. I'm sure some of you, I don't want to plug, but some of you read about the announcement Google made yesterday, where we are bringing the duplex capability, which is you can screen the calls, or even call a restaurant and make a reservation on your behalf, right? A lot of this is happening because the investments these large companies are making the underlying technologies more affordable, so that AI and ML can be brought into lots of different contexts, right? In my mind, I think that opens up a very unique opportunity for startups, where at the end of the day, startups are all about building the right product, but they should also be saying, how can we benefit from this wave of investments and technologies that can make our products better? And I think that's pretty exciting for me. And the fact is, pretty much all the big companies out there, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, are making these investments. I think there is a tailwind that the startups can benefit from.
So I think I'd probably agree with all of that, that great companies can be built without AI, that in many cases the preconditions for AI is that you have a lot of useful data and you may have had to build something with workflow to get that data first. But I still maintain, and maybe I have to as an investor in AI for startups, that there are problems that were not solvable before that we can start tackling now because AI exists. And that's a really interesting category to invest into, because we have a really good answer to the question, why now? Like, why is this a good market that hasn't already been served? Let me get a quick census in the room. How many people here are yourselves entrepreneurs or employees of startups? Okay. And how many? Sorry, Ron. Once your IPO is on the horizon, you no longer count as a startup. What about big company people? Okay. Investors? Just us? Okay. Few? All right. Wonderful. Anybody? Any other category I've missed? Journalists? Nope. Lawyers? All of the above. Okay. Great. And so, sounds to me like then we can kind of keep talking about startups and the opportunities for startups with a pretty clean conscience. So let's talk about, I think Suresh raised an interesting point, which is that there's huge investments going into the platforms to enable AI and make it accessible and affordable. And that's simultaneously an opportunity for startups, but it's also an opportunity for startups to get clobbered. And so the conventional wisdom is that it's hard for startups to compete directly with giants, but where is their opportunity? There's still space not to get trampled by a Google or an Amazon?
I think that's definitely a question I'm sure on top of a lot of people's minds. I think one of the big issues is it's not the AI technology that kind of gives these big companies advantage, it's the data, right? I think, let's be very honest. I think that's where the value is. However, startups can take on these big giants by focusing on the more user-facing problems, which are not always directly correlated with the data advantage, right? It's about solving a specific user problem that doesn't rely as much on the the residual data or the historical data. I have seen quite a few innovations, especially in the areas that I deal with, whether it's smart home, communications, or entertainment, and these areas. In fact, these big companies have acquired these startups quite regularly. I think that's why the point was the product is the focus, but then AI is something that enables you to do better.
So I like to think of this first in terms of horizontals and then in terms of verticals. And there's a lot of startups right now that are spending a lot of time on the horizontal as it relates to machine learning and AI. And while I think there may be some opportunity to sort of quote what Aaron said earlier, it's helpful to think of this in terms of a sustaining or a disruptive innovation. Like, are the things that the startups are doing today things that like Jeff Dean and the Google team can't figure out how to do whenever they want, and they just hit the button and turn that on? And how much of the research that's coming out of Google, Facebook, Baidu, et cetera, isn't already being open sourced? And so what is your truly uncanny disruptive innovation that you can bring to this really interesting field of AI, and that's a very high bar. There are certainly examples, and then most of those companies wind up being acquired by the few companies I just mentioned. And so when I think about opportunity in the AI space, I think some of that may exist there, but it's going to be very hard to outrun the cloud apparatuses of a lot of these large vendors. And so I like to think in terms of verticals of opportunity and what data set and sort of actions can you take that these large vendors would have just absolutely no interest in competing with you. I used to use an example. I'm like, Google has a really good security team, but gosh, like they would never start a security company, would they? Then of course they went ahead and did that. So that's perhaps a worse example. But it has to be the sort of data that you don't think for whatever reason Google has enough interest to go after, because you don't want to deal with that giant. You want to have this unfair advantage and tailwind where they're not going to come and eat your lunch.
Yeah, and I think the Googles and the Facebooks and the Palantirs of the world, they have amazing infrastructure. I don't think they have a monopoly on domain problem sets, right? And so there are a lot of interesting problems in the world where it's not, don't start with what is the AI company I can build, which is what is the problem I want to solve, and AI is a tool to solve that. And I don't think any of these companies have a monopoly on the tool. I think the problem set is, and the universe is wide open. Right.
And unfortunately, AI people and domain experts tend not to hang out in the same place. And so as we think about company formation, these are almost the two most polar opposites of the spectrum. And so team creation in this space to have the unique domain knowledge and the insight of how to bring data analysis to bear, these are tricky teams to put together.
One quick note I want to add is, in fact, I think some of the machine learning technologies themselves might make it easier for the startups to play. One really good example is federated machine learning that some of the researchers have been proposing, where you're not reliant on as much of the centralized data sets. You're relying more on the individual small sets of data on the user premises, which could be a very promising way to kind of play with the giants.
Let me give the audience a little bit of an opportunity to jump in here. What questions rise for you out of what we've said so far? Yeah.
Hi, it's from SwiftChip. We're a platform that delivering home healthcare, and we are incorporating machine learning. And now that we're doing it, we're sort of looking at the driving the bus problem, because you're optimizing a platform and you're moving people around, but eventually there's always something has to give. If you optimize one thing, then you're obviously changing or reducing the something else that delivered. With your experience, how did you said you implemented machine learning in a Facebook feed, and you're running it on your platform. How are you thinking about creating the structures to make sure that you're not doing really bad things through optimizing something and without realizing what are the consequences for the ecosystem?
He just reminded me of a funny conversation I had last week.
Let me repeat the question first,
Sure.
maybe for posterity. So Asaf is the founder of a company that's using AI to deliver home health care, and one thing he's found is that when you apply machine learning to some kind of pipeline or logistics, when you optimize one thing, you're moving the bottlenecks around. So how do you think about holistically solving it? I'm paraphrasing now, but how do you think about holistically solving the problem and understanding the side effects of where you're optimizing? Is that a good? Okay.
So I'll answer your question in a second, but we were pitching to a very large customer, and a lot of our marketing material says, using closed loop machine learning to improve healthcare and all that. And this large company brought their chief medical officer and said, I'm very concerned. How are you going to prevent the machine learning from making mistakes with our patients? Huh? Yeah. No, and I had to explain to her. I said, look, the machine learning is actually a very aspirational part of our business. Right now, we're actually using human beings, right? So I don't know what the nature of your specific business is, but I can't imagine that on day one you have the data. Like, it sounds like you're optimizing some networking or allocation, but that's not machine learning per se.
No. It's routing, right? You're figuring out how to maximize throughput of. It's like a Lyft Uber problem.
It's more heuristics, I would say, than AI, what we would consider classical AI, right? So I would say that initially, a lot of this is you do it by hand. You do a manual process. You learn what works. You optimize your rules, and then when you have a lot of data, then you can start building AI. I don't think you can build AI on day one for a problem like that, right?
My name is Yoav. I'm from a startup in Israel called. My name is Yoav. I'm from a startup in Israel called Amplio Speech, and we provide technology-driven speech and language pathology therapy in special education. And my observation is not all the AI is in the cloud. There's a lot that has to go into the edge. So in the edge, maybe Google also have power, maybe Facebook will have started to put edge devices. Amazon is putting an edge device. So what's your perspective on AI on the edge?
This is one of my personal passions. Based on I worked in silicon industry. In fact, the startup that I worked on, we tried to build a solution that would have been perfect for ML and AI, but it's 10 years ago, unfortunately. I think that's actually a very important point. I think in my mind, I see that as a big revolutionary step forward because, especially the advances in silicon, the algorithms themselves, the architecture allows the cost of these solutions to be drastically reduced, and you all already cited some examples. Pretty much all the big mobile phones today have really capable, ML hardware. I think, 4 to 5 years from now, you will see pretty much every edge device, consumer hardware device, supporting a fairly capable ML block. Now, that doesn't mean it automatically opens up the doors for you. There are still a lot of framework problems that we need to solve, but just in terms of capabilities, I think we'll have really capable device moving forward. I think, and in fact, companies investing in that direction, I think, are making the right bets.
I would just add, it's increasingly becoming a continuum. You have your edge devices, you have all sorts of CDN or intermediary layers, and you have home base. And developers, I think there'll be more and more empowering hardware, but developers are going to have to sort of reason about what to do where. And is there a huge use case for training something at the edge today? I don't know, maybe in very esoteric or special applications. Inference at the edge to help people with whatever the task at hand seems logical and increasingly inevitable. How we deal with the constraints that we're operating in, and particularly if things aren't plugged in from a wattage perspective, well, people are just going to have to make some trade-offs.
One quick example I want to cite, Google as a company we faced is, the funny thing is the mobile and data connectivity, despite the advances we made, it's still not as reliable as you would like to be, right? In fact, in some of the developing countries, it's a huge problem. So we're actually finding it's better to invest in edge compute and solve the problem at the edge. Like speech recognition is a classic example, where then you don't even care if the data connection is unreliable, right? Most of the stuff that the user wants to talk to you about, you can respond even without the data connection.
I mean, I'll just kick in one last thought, which is, though I agree very much with what Suresh and Jake both said, like one last concern when you're inferring at the edge, when you're solving problems at the edge, is frequently the interaction with the user is also the source of the data set that's going to train the model. And so even if the model's interacting with the user at the edge, there does have to be a way. If that data is crucial, if that's your feedback loop, if that's your virtuous loop, there does have to be a way to get data back to home base to train all the models. Right, exactly. That can be done batch. That doesn't have to be real time, but always a consideration. Yes, actually, here, let me run my mic to you.
Yesterday, I moderated a panel on explainable AI at another conference, and I asked my panelists, why are only you doing explainable AI and 99% of people are doing black box? And they felt that because of compliance and other rules, that everyone would switch to explainable. So I'm curious about your views about whether people are starting to care about that, and do you think in the long term they will care a lot about it?
So we were just joking before the panel started. Back in the day, in the 90s, when you were building machine learning models, everything was explainable. Your model typically was very simple. It was some sort of regression. The parameters were very visible and interpretable. And in recent decades, with deep learning, with hidden neural networks, you end up with a model that you don't actually understand what's inside, right? And you don't know when you present it with new inputs what the resulting output will be. I think part of the fear that is happening now with the media and, will AI take over the world and are we going to, right? No, but I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that a lot of the more sophisticated modern models we have are black boxes, and we don't understand actually what's going on inside them, right? And so this engenders the fear. I think from a machine learning point of view, right? Someone made a comment about Facebook, right? These models react in ways that are hard to anticipate because you don't understand that what's going on inside. I think as a data scientist whose task is to train the model, it's not very satisfying when you don't really know, what is it? What are the levers that you can pull, and how does it change the outcome in a very deep way? I think all things being equal, it would be preferable to have an explainable model than a black box, right?
Well, that's kind of duh.
Yeah.
Right. If you could, you would.
If you could, you would. On the other hand, I think you're...
What I'm focusing on is, are B2B customers now starting to say, give me explainable or I don't want it? Will they say that?
That's just repeating. Is the market at a point where the market is rejecting solutions that aren't explainable?
I think there will be domains...
I think you're in one of them.
Yeah, in healthcare, for example, I think or cars that drive into the side of trucks because they look like the sky. I mean, there's all these areas I think where it's going to face a lot of scrutiny.
I think it's very much tied into the regulatory and compliance climate, and in different countries, candidly, we'll have a different perspective. There's some areas where, if I want to train my machine learning model to approve a loan, and then it turns out, like post hoc, that there's some racial bias or something else, God forbid, in it, like it's not a wonderful place to be. And because of the regulatory climate in which those folks operate in, it's probably no good. But I think there's other areas where we're seeing increasingly even alternative methods used to explain to mere mortals what's going on. At the end of the day, if I want to find an advanced persistent threat in my IT infrastructure, do I exactly care how I got to it? I kind of like to know so I can make a rule and improve my systems going forward. But like I'll probably take that. I'll act on it and see what good can come from it. And so I think it's somewhat situationally dependent, and people have to evaluate whether the sort of lack of explainability is worth the extra increment of precision or identification that you get for it.
It kind of reminds me of I heard the joke yesterday on the radio about like after the Zuckerberg's testimony at the Senate, like there were t-shirts being printed at Facebook says, how do you make money? Yeah, we run ads, right? I think that the question of the explainability will likely be, I think as Jake kind of alluded to, a regulatory requirement which will force. I don't think the market will demand it because I expect the results from these black box models, these complex models, are going to be so significantly better. Think of like self-driving cars, right? I think the models are...
I'll say what I said yesterday, which was, you want a car that runs over one person every 300 million miles, or a car that runs over one person every 100 million miles, but tells the family why it did.
I think that's absolutely. I think that's the meta point. Even when recently there was an accident in San Francisco with Uber's, Arizona, sorry, with Uber's self-driving car, the immediate data point that everybody started throwing around was, Uber was testing whatever 100,000 miles versus the other companies that were doing millions of miles. But I think it's going to be a real issue. But I suspect, just from a business point of view, it's the regulatory environment which will force the explainability.
I mean, Jake commented that we VCs, to make ourselves feel like we're doing real work, have to come up with these little frameworks. And this is one thing Zetta thinks about a lot is something we call the AI risk curve. And so I think, it's not a yes or no question, does the market require explainability or not? It's more about which market, which problem, and what's driving it. And our belief is that AI there's a reason AI got its boots on in consumer. It got it, the first commercial uses of AI were like Netflix recommending movies, Amazon saying if you buy this, you should buy that, Facebook's newsfeed, where it was a convex payoff. If we got it right, if Netflix shows you some movies that you do want to watch, you watch more movies and it's great. And if they show you some movies you don't want to watch, well, it was still no worse than not showing you a recommendation. For problems like that, explainability is not very important, because if it works, there's good upside. If it doesn't work, there's little to no downside. At least when we implemented the newsfeed, we thought there was little to no downside. And now, as we sort of enter the B2B world and we think about, okay, but now my business depends on this, again, where do we see the first adoption of AI, the first willingness to accept maybe a black box approach to making a decision that is not explained or owned by a human? And I think it's unsurprising. We see it in companies like Chorus and Gong. We see it in companies doing sales and marketing acceleration, or we see it in ad tech, right? We see it where, hey, if it works, it drives incrementally more top line. If it doesn't work, it's sort of, we didn't lose a customer, we didn't lose an account. And so I think that it's not just about the regulatory and the compliance environment, it's actually about how big is the downside relative to the upside. The security example is a good example where if I'm finding more attacks, that's pure upside. That's attacks I didn't know about before. I think self-driving cars is an example of something with potentially very large downside, with fatal downside. And I think that, Dan's living in a world in healthcare where the liability consequences are very large. And as Zetta looks at startups, I would say in the last 2 years, a full third of the startups we've been looking at in the AI space have been trying to apply AI to healthcare, and so far we've invested in one. And that is because frequently when we talk to healthcare customers, we find that even if the AI works better than a human, the lack of explainability is preventing them from adopting, is preventing them from being willing to adopt it and trust it. And I think healthcare is probably at one polar extreme of hesitation. But I think even other well-regulated industries like financial services have absolutely adopted AI. They've adopted it for fraud detection first, where, again, high upside, maybe minimal downside. They've also adopted it for credit applications, for loan applications. And they're starting to. Absolutely, the leading edge ones are starting to. But the way they do it, the way they solve the explainability problem is they don't have full automation. They put a human being in the loop, the human gets the AI's recommendation, but the human makes the final call. That's how they solve the compliance issue. So there is a range, and it depends on the problem. And I think you can have reasonable frameworks to decide whether a given domain, like where it's going to fall on that risk curve. But absolutely, we are watching in real time this unfold, and I think it's changing every year. But I do think that it's incumbent on the industry, that there's tremendous pressure on the industry to develop more explainable, that there is a market for AI that can explain itself. Let's see. I'm going to go here.
I want to go back to the comment about putting the domain experts and the AI experts in the room, and how the horizontal and the vertical come together. I just want to question, based on your experience, if there is a commercial company, have an AI problem to solve, what are some of the mechanism ecosystem for get access to the startup thinking along those verticals versus, if I work at a company, it's very easy for me to just go talk to Google or Facebook and try to hire engineers and build it ourselves. So how do we create room for startups to be part of that solution?
We meaning the big company?
Just ecosystem general. How do we make that cross-pollination happen better?
Cross-pollination between enterprises and startups. How can it be
I think the question was broader than just startups. Let's start with big companies. So I think what big companies do is they go and they hire companies like Palantir, which inject, an AI team into their, for a startup, most startups that I can think of, typically it's the founding team where you have a computer science person and some, person from the med school, or, they have this idea and they bring together a team that can do both the AI and the domain expertise.
I don't know that there's an easy answer. I'd sort of say anecdotally, back in the day, two decades ago, you got started building a product, and who would you put in the room? You'd put an engineer and then a product manager. And then a decade ago, you decided, okay, you need to put a product manager, an engineer, and a designer. Today, there's a fourth element, and it's like someone that's thinking cleanly about data capture. Because if you're not actually identifying and managing the data set of interest, probably not going to be a lot of opportunity to do advanced analytics over time. And I think in many cases, there's a very positive ROI to thinking through that stuff at the outset. And then the question is just, what resources do you actually need to be successful if you don't have the sufficient domain expertise on your team? I think that's a fundamental problem. I think you have to hire those people. And then how to solve it from the startup side, whether you're using the big cloud offerings or you're using offerings from startups. I think there's increasingly more tools that lower the bar and help you go through this crawl, walk, run, where you can try different techniques and see what the ROI is. Of course, there's going to be ways to outsource it, but just like on average, we wouldn't recommend outsourcing like the building of your entire product. We also wouldn't recommend outsourcing too much of the secret sauce and how you stitch that all together.
I think one quick comment I would make is, larger companies have a bit of an advantage because these companies build more dedicated teams that are focused on like ML and technologies. I think there's going to be probably an inflection point where it's probably not a bad idea for startups to have like 1 or 2 experts, like a machine learning kind of experts on the staff. It may be too early now, but I think there's going to be a point where that'll be very helpful.
Thank you. Hi, this is loud. I'm Micha from Chorus.ai. We transcribe sales conversations in real time and analyze them and surface insights in order to help sales teams sell better and achieve their quota, improve their quota. When we began the company 3 years ago, so we invested probably a whole year before we launched the product in AI, building our own speech models, acoustic model, language model, phonetic dictionaries, what have you, all the NLP, all the machine learning, and so on and so forth, because we thought it would give us an advantage. And, now speech is being commoditized to some degree. We do have actually, not to toot our own horn, but we do have an advantage because we have the data, not because our algorithms are better. And, 3 years in, we're, at a kind of cross path. We don't know whether to invest more in what I call integration, basically integrating ourselves into workflows, or innovation. Me being the chief scientist, obviously I know where I want to invest, but we're trying to discern what's better for the business itself and as we grow and as we scale. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Can I ask you a question about your product first?
For sure.
So is it just for phone calls, or is it?
Mostly conference calls, so we integrate with
Okay.
Zoom, WebEx, and so on and so forth. We also integrate with phone calls, though, yeah.
Okay.
Well, obviously, you need to spend the first 12 hours of the day innovating and the second 12 hours of the day on workflow. That's the solution, right?
So one quick question is, how are you seeing the results of this, speech transcription itself? I know, just to give you an example, I wouldn't bet on Google models to be doing that job particularly well either. So.
By the way, for your benefit, Google is by far the best out-of-the-box solution that we've tested. So, but yes, it completely is insufficient for out-of-vocabulary verbiage and stuff like that.
Actually, there was a podcast last week at VoiceBot AI. There is a podcast called VoiceBot AI. And last week, there was someone there said that only 10% of utterances transcribed that's the industry standard, only 10% of the utterances are 90% correct, okay? And they're doing like fusion of multiple ones in order to get more. So this is like the state of the art.
So I think it's highly unlikely we on this panel are going to have particularly useful wisdom for the nuances of your situation. But the first comment I'd make is really defining exactly what you think your competitive edge relative, to voice transcription is going to be. Is it the human element on top that helps get you that last few percent? Is it the very specific sales-related ontological stuff that isn't how normal humans have, your average conversation that, maybe Google is not going to train and optimize for? Or is it embedding it more into these actionable workflows and measuring the return? And to the extent that some of the base layers are commoditized, I think it's great to find a strategy to outsource it. I'd be very, very careful about single sourcing it or relying on one vendor if you don't think there's multiple vendors, and arguably it's not commoditized until there's a couple of vendors that you could trust to do this sort of thing. But I think it's very forward-looking to continually ask yourself the question. And in general, in almost all cases of you draw these histories even to like my role at Splunk. Once upon a time, it was really hard to ingest and index a lot of data. At some point, some of these basic things are going to become a lot more commoditized, and value just inevitably moves up towards the stack, and you want to make sure you're doing it at the right rate that makes sense for your business.
All I'll say is I've seen in the last 24 months at least a dozen startups behind you, but definitely running to this market. And so I think, but I also think that, which I think is good evidence that the market's materializing, actually. But I also, again, I think it's sort of super hard for this panelist, first to give you generic advice that's actually relevant to your situation. But if I can think of a piece of generic advice that has always been true in my experience, it is that focusing on your competition, on what your competition is doing, is never as good a guide as focusing on what your customer wants from you. And as long as customers are happy and you're in front, which you are, then you can kind of let the competition worry about themselves.
Thank you very much.
I think Raphael has been waiting the longest.
It's okay. So quick question for you. What are some of the domains that you believe are underserved and can use AI love?
Food delivery. Just kidding. Sorry if there's any food deliverers in the room. I really think I really think actually that there are a lot of markets and problems that have been underserved by the tech industry, that have been underserved by technology in general, that I would call technology deserts. And I think the conditions are right for almost all of them to receive some love. I think because AI lets us bring automation, lets us automate tasks that were not automatable before, and also because there is kind of a generational turnover where a lot of, roles that were traditionally held by people who were technophobic, like those are now millennials, and millennials by and large are not technophobic. But I think I'm really excited about industries like manufacturing, supply chain, logistics, like how we move food around the world. And it's hard to say that there's so many good ideas for manufacturing and agriculture. It's hard to say it's underserved by AI, but I think there are still huge swaths of those industries, like the 99% of those industries are still done manually, or the pinnacle of automation is like emailing spreadsheets around. That I think that there's just incredible work to do in those spaces. Shipping containers is a problem I love, and I have seen startups tackling it, but like we haven't solved it yet. So I think there's a lot of work to do there.
So I'd say, I mean, first of all, I think it's a pretty nuanced discussion in terms of what problems are easy or hard for AI to solve. I think more broadly speaking, automating sort of tasks that are easy for humans, I'm a little bit more bullish on more broadly than automating tasks that are impossible for humans. But to your point earlier, there's so much attention to the classic Silicon Valley, Bay Area topics. And so there's a lot of sales and marketing startups. That doesn't mean there's not plenty of room for innovation in that domain, but there's thousands of startups in that space. And if we look at just more traditional business processes, there's a lot fewer people that are spending their time and energy on those areas. And so I do think they could be quite opportunity rich. I will make the comment that for a lot of these industries, the question is not, can the AI add value? I think the answer in almost all cases is tautologically yes. And for some of these areas that aren't natural for Bay Area investors, the question becomes much more one of go-to-market efficiency and sales cycle. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for people that can figure out how to sell into some of these industries and bring some of that technology with them.
Hey, hi, my name is Tomer. I'm from iMedits. We do medical imaging analysis. Thank you for TensorFlow. Use it a lot. I have a question regarding business models. So a lot of the startups are doing better tasks than what they did before, better statistics, better sensitivity, etc. And when you're an investor, how do you evaluate the business model behind that? So you get to, some of the startups really define categories, some of them don't. Some of them go to healthcare, where you're coming up with a solution that providers sometimes don't know how to pay for, don't know what's the real value in it, even though technically speaking it can be amazing. So what do you think about the business model, how you evaluate them? That's the question.
Can I share what happened between us?
Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So I actually pitched Jake earlier this summer, and it was a very warm pitch. I mean, the water was good, but he decided not to invest in our company, and it wasn't because we didn't have a good product or the good technology. It's because he rightfully perceived the challenge that was going to be in the penetrating the health ecosystem. And having done this now for close to 2.5 years, I can tell you 100%. Innovation in healthcare, it's not about the technology. It's about navigating the complexities of the regulatory constraints, the entrenched interests, the payers, providers. Everyone is, it's not a technology problem. So I don't think I think innovation, it's necessary to have some technology, but it's not sufficient. And I think the big challenge in many of these industries is not coming up with a better AI or coming up with a better way of doing it. It's how do you, align yourselves with the right constituents, the right stakeholders to actually change something in a very complicated system, and also dealing with the regulations in many cases.
Hi, I'm Ami from Scream. We created a GPU database for large data sets. And because we run on GPUs, you can imagine we run a lot of deep learning and machine learning workloads. And the general question is, what do you think AI is really? Because you can create a new company selling food for cats with AI, and you have a better chance to get funds. So a lot of statistical algorithms or usual algorithms get the title AI, being implemented on large data sets, solving a problem. So for you, I heard from your previous answers talking about automation for different types of problem. What is the definition of AI for you guys?
I almost wish our industry had not landed on the term artificial intelligence to describe this basket of technologies, because I feel like, it evokes, sort of 1970s science fiction, close the pod bay doors, Hal. I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave, right? Like we think of consciousness or sentience, and, that's not, I think, what any of us mean by those technologies. And I think Jake also made a really great point, which is lots of problems don't require machine learning, don't require deep learning. They could be solved with a linear regression. They could be solved with analytics. So I do think if your point is that the label AI itself maybe doesn't connote much beyond hype, I think that's fair. But I also think that there is substance beyond the label. I do think there are a category of problems that we can automate solutions to using machine learning, using deep learning, that could not be solved. And that opens up new markets where technology couldn't be before. When I think, I can't speak for every investor. When I meet an investor who tells me they specialize in AI and blockchain, what I imagine is that they are specialists in hype because that's the only thing those two technologies have in common. But Zetta is an investor, is a VC. I'm taking this answer personally because Zetta is a VC firm that is focused on AI. And so what does that actually mean? Why is that a sector to focus on? And for us, what we truly think and what we truly look for before we write a check is, are there data network effects? Is there a virtuous loop where the more customers you get, the more data you collect, the better your model performs, the better your recommendations are, the more the value you're creating for your customers compounds, and the more the next customer to sign on creates more value for the whole network, not just for themselves. And those network effects, we think, are usually but not always found in companies that are applying machine learning and deep learning techniques, and are the type of thing that can give a small startup an edge over competitors trying to catch up to them, or incumbents trying to commoditize them. And so, in truth, although we label ourselves an AI investing firm, what we're really investing in is data network effects.
And while there's a lot of truth to this commentary, and we could get very semantic about what the precise edge of this term is, inevitably what excites us is data-driven software. And I think almost all businesses are either becoming more data-driven in some way, shape, or form, whether it's Walmart with physical stores, or companies learning from their user behavior to improve the quality of their service. And there's just going to be data-driven businesses and then not so successful businesses. I think it's probably going to be as simple as that.
Yeah, I always prefer the machine intelligence over AI because of the, it's a much more loaded term. I think I go back to Jocelyn's point. I think some problems are inherently so much harder to solve without the techniques that are available under machine intelligence, right? I think that's why, and I'm sure this fad will pass too, right? Like a couple of years, people will get a little more, sane about this. But I think the reality is what matters in the end is what are you delivering to the user? What benefit are you delivering? I think that should be the focus.
I think we'll have time for 2 or 3 more questions over here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Asif. I'm a machine learning consultant and advisor. My question is... My question is something that worries me personally. It's about the commoditization of machine learning. Today, any company that I meet and wants to start having a machine learning work done within it needs an expert. And even if they're using technologies that are pretty much off the shelf, they reach some level of accuracy, and then someone needs to know how to take it higher, make it consumer ready, and so on. When do you think, within how many years, do you think this would not be the case anymore? Any unexperienced developer would be able to tackle a problem using off-the-shelf products that are machine learning products?
10 years. No, because I say this because my high school, I have a kid in high school, and for his sophomore year project, he and his 15-year-old buddy built some sort of speech recognition using off-the-shelf tools. So I figure in 10 years, when he's actually in the work environment, we'll all be out of work. So.
I think this is an interesting question. I mean, it's definitely the classic pattern is like, hey, people who are business analysts today are going to be able to be data scientists tomorrow because they can just sort of draft on increasingly prepackaged, elements. And I don't know, for as often as we've been through that cycle in the decades of technological advancement, however high we pile the Lego blocks to stand on, we always seem to be able to find more difficult problems to tackle, standing on top of those shoulders of those giants, and we haven't run out of headroom yet. So I kind of believe that there will always be a role for experts to play, but certainly that what requires an expert today will not in 10 years, and that's just, I think that's almost a trite thing to say about technology. But I do think something that is a little bit different about this generation, to Dan's point, is I do think that we are going to have a set of I think millennials compared to prior generations were comfortable being users of technology and adopting it in every part of their lives. And I think this next generation coming up is going to be comfortable manipulating technology, raising the hood, building technology, not just using it. And so I don't know. So maybe things will look different in 10, 20 years. But the way in which it will look different is not that like novices can do the work of experts, but actually maybe expertise is much more broadly distributed, is what I'm trying badly to say. Are VCs becoming more technical? Can our work be replaced by AI? I think that I think that investing in the larger the company is and the more data, especially financial data, there is about it, the more it becomes a machine problem to make a decision what to invest in. And I think like all the way out to the public equities market, that's now a machine problem, right? Like machines trade public stocks better than humans do. I think the smaller the company is, the smaller the data about the company that exists, the more it's a small data problem, not a big data problem. So I think VC is sort of the earliest stage of investment along the stack. The more subjectivity there probably the more role there is. Sorry, you asked the question as a joke, and I'm answering it literally, but I think about this problem all the time. But I do think we absolutely must and need to be very data-driven in our approach and very data-informed. And actually, where everybody zeroes in on like the picking as the essential thing that investors do, but I actually think what is much more important is how we have coverage, how we have awareness of all the startups that are out there. That is a data problem.
There's actually a VC firm called Correlation Ventures that we talk to, and they basically are trying to apply AI to investment. They want to know data about your founders, data about your competitors, data about if you have a previous round, who your investors are, and they have a predictive model that tells them whether they should invest in you or not.
Anything to add, Jake?
How do they do it? Do you know if they're doing well?
I have no idea. Google GV also has, I can't confirm, but if you read a lot of the news, they also have a similar model. And so, look, the question is sort of maybe goes back to that risk reward explainability thing. Are you gonna accept that input, and what's the outcome of that input, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I read that in news too.
Yeah. Social Capital has launched this capital as a service. Service. I think Signalfire is another one. I mean, there's a bunch of people experimenting with this for sure. For sure, it's active. Okay. One more question from the audience? Otherwise, all right. And I do have one more question too.
Just one comment. We hear a lot about innovation, and I kind of think about it deeply, about what is innovation, inventing the wheel, and then the internet, and, things like that. And I see a commonality about all of those inventions, that they are not owned by anyone. And then the question is, as you look at, the startup climate today, investors, everything is kind of monetary. You talk about return of investment, you talk about business models, but, most innovations are kind of not owned by anyone. The ones that are like holding for life, IP, TCP IP, emails, things that are like that. And then, people are trying to reinvent that, but at the end of the day, those ones continue to hold. So the question is, what is the portion, maybe, in a company that should be dedicated into either an open source or something that is not owned by anyone and developed by the community?
I was going to say the math is open source. The data is proprietary. Right? The algorithms, the math, everyone knows how to implement, hidden Markov models or, deep learning. It's a question of what is your unique data that's proprietary to you. So I think
as a company, your inventions, the output is going to be proprietary for you. This is like intellectual property.
Yeah.
And then the question is whether this can serve as kind of a platform for the entire work, like TCP/IP, or like emails as a communication platform that does not own by anyone.
So I think the way the world is, kind of the trend right now is, Google is open sourcing the tools, the TensorFlow, right, the model building tools, But the data is the thing that's unique to the companies, and I think companies will be very reluctant to open source it. That's their, that takes a lot of time and money to collect that data, build training models on that data. So I think TCP/IP is an infrastructure. I think the infrastructure can be open sourced and owned by everyone eventually, right? There won't be any constraints on the underlying infrastructure, but I think the data will be the thing that will be the proprietary thing.
I mean, there's obviously quite successful, completely proprietary databases. There's quite successful open source databases. There's, maybe the book is yet to be written on how all those business models work in the fullness of time. One comment I would make, particularly around, we'll just call it the world of algorithms, is there has been this sort of the current state is a lot of these things need to be fundamentally open source and peer reviewed in academia to collect good standing. And the black box approach has been harder. I do think we will see innovation at a fundamental level, perhaps even from some of the cloud providers, in how we can change the dynamics on that. Where if you think the algorithm is the actual innovation, are there potentially ways to protect that? And I think the choice of how much to sort of share with the world and how much to protect yourself is an individual company business decision. And I think there's paths to success in both ways.
Just to be fair, I think over the last 15, 20 years, I think tech industry has been much more open about, probably Microsoft was the last company that has done a lot more things in kind of, in a closed fashion way. Google, Facebook, and all these big companies have been pretty open about not right away, but releasing their technologies, fairly soon after their launch into public domain.
I mean, I'm a capitalist. It's right there in the name. And so, yep. Yes, we will. This will be the final answer. So, all I'll say about it is I think that companies have a responsibility to do what's right for their business. And I think making things open for the sake of making them open is not a responsibility that you have as a company. But companies like Facebook and Google and now Microsoft have become much, much more open, not out of virtue, but out of capitalism, because that was what the market wanted and needed from them. And it has transpired that great things have resulted. But it is also the case that there are other institutions behind companies that can be responsible for innovation, and that includes government and academia and publicly funded research. And I think we should all, as citizens, be concerned whether there is adequate investment in those areas. And I think we're certainly living in the world at an interesting time in which some nations are making much more concerted efforts and investments in AI than others. And we'll see how that all works out in a 10 to 20 year time horizon. All right, enjoy lunch on that note.